Well then, you say on page 9, I think this is really interesting. We read every day that there's a crisis in the universities, particularly with COVID and foreign students. We hear all the time that they don't have money and governments are starving them and so forth. But you're right, if there is a crisis in the Australian university system, it is not primarily a financial crisis, nor is it, properly speaking, a free speech crisis. We hear a lot about that too. You're right, it's a moral crisis. It's a breach of faith, a betrayal of the public trust. You know, you are effectively saying it's a failure of mission. Can you elaborate on this? And I assume it's not just Australia. You
Not
have
just
broad
Australia.
international experience. Our university is so core to the Western model of, if you like, advancement, nourishing of our cultures, seems to be in crisis everywhere.
We hear about the financial crisis all the time. Australian universities are well funded by global standards and are well funded by historical Australian
I'm
standards.
tempted to say, can you say
let's
that
talk-
again? Because it's not.
Let's talk more about that in a few minutes. There's no free speech crisis at Australian universities. There have been problems here and there. The Peter Ridd case is an extreme example, but they're rare problems. They've been mostly corrected. We see a lot of support for freedom of speech at Australian universities. The real crisis is a moral one. The crisis is the question, what master do the universities serve? Are they there for the community or are they there for themselves? This is the fundamental question at the heart of everything about Australia's universities and universities globally as well. They increasingly, we gave them enormous autonomy to operate as independent institutions, doing what's good for society, but according to their own cognizance, that they could follow the stars towards the truth, towards what's really best for our young people and for society as a whole. But unfortunately, when you give people that kind of self-control or self-authority, it too often ends up as self-indulgence. What we see in Australia's universities especially is a load of self-indulgence, of universities pursuing university goals without regard to what's good for their students, what's good for the country, what's good for the world. It's really just all about the universities as institutions. And that's why when it comes to university policy, for the most part, the Group of 8, Universities of Australia, the National Tertiary Education Union, the student unions, they're pretty much all on the same side because they're fighting for the universities, not fighting for the community.
I'll come back to that in a moment. To take a cul-de-sac, but a very important one, you said you don't think there's a free speech crisis, and yet it's frequently painted as a narrowness in views, a reluctance to engage with different ideas. Perhaps the greater problem is that there's not a lot of people putting an alternative.
There is a viewpoint diversity problem. Your guest, Jonathan Haidt, has talked quite a bit about that.
Yeah.
That viewpoint diversity problem arises from the university's autonomy. They hire who they want to hire.
Yeah.
Now, initially, when the University of Sydney was set up, the hiring was done by a panel of people in Sydney who had university degrees from the mother country, and they hired probably a pretty good diverse set of people to run their university. But over time, as that set of people hires their successors and hires their successors and hires their successors, they go into very narrow avenues of, very constrained fields of thought that maybe are interesting to the people who run universities, but aren't necessarily interesting to students or to the rest of the world. More importantly, they become politicized all in one direction. I mean, if you imagine giving a group of either liberals or conservatives or progressives control over an organization, maybe they only have 60% control. Well, every hiring committee is 60% on one side. The next generation's hiring committee is 80% on one side. The next generation's hiring committee is 95% on one side. And that's what's happened with universities. They've gone from being places that broadly reflected society. All of the university graduates in society together nominate who the next generation's professors will be, to being places that really represent a very narrow segment of public opinion. They are not broadly reflective of society in the way, say, the business community is. I mean, the business community, there are labor donors, there are liberal donors, there are people who donate to third parties, there are people who vote for if the business community were all on one side, you wouldn't really have competitive elections in Australia. Well, the university community, is all on one side. It is, and I don't just mean the arts faculties. I mean the entire university. You would struggle to find Liberal or National Party supporters in Australia's universities. I'm sure there are a few hidden in the little nooks, afraid to poke their heads above the parapets. I've had people email me saying, "Salvatore, thanks for pointing this out, but I wouldn't say anything in public." Well, I'm an American. I'm not part of these Australian political debates. I'm just here kind of to help Australians understand what's going on in their own universities, in their institutions that they pay for.
And this is something you can actually track, as I understand it, both in America and in the UK, for example. There's a lot of work that shows
we have a lot of survey work in the US. There's none in Australia that I'm aware of, but the phenomenon, it's very clear in Australia that
the sort of numbers we're talking about are really very graphic. You go back 30 years ago and you had a surprisingly even split between those who would self-identify as left of centre and those of right. Now it's overwhelmingly, minuscule numbers who will self-identify as anything other than left of centre.
And people's politics are not the issue. People have a right to their own politics. It's their behavior that's the problem. It's once you have a department that is so dominated by one point of view, they just don't question that point of view. They don't question, well, should people be thinking anything else? It's just not part of polite discussion. I teach a class on the future of work at the University of Sydney, and it's simply accepted that the future of work should be socialist. Now, if I point out that, well, there are a lot of people who don't agree with that, probably the majority of people who don't agree with that, well, that makes me a serious outlier.
Does this go back to the very thing you're talking about, though? A technical class, an expertocracy that doesn't care what ordinary people think. It's not relevant.
It's not that they don't care. I think they're even unaware that such a gulf exists. They delegitimize the gulf. That is, if there's a gulf, it's because those people who disagree are cretins, racists, sexists. Something is wrong with them if they disagree. That's really the problem. If we just had polite disagreements, all right. Even if university professors disagreed with the general population on an issue, fine, they're better educated, they've studied the problem. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is a self-referential group of people who no longer even are aware that there are other valid opinions or believe that other opinions simply aren't valid. And the reason is that they don't find those opinions in their colleagues. They don't find those opinions in their PhD students. They may find them in their undergraduates occasionally, but it's very tough to be an undergraduate who disagrees. And I want to emphasize this is not limited to the humanities and social sciences. This is something we find. You may think that there's no such thing as socialist physics or socialist math, but I guarantee you there is.
Really?
Because it's not.
So 2 plus 2 doesn't automatically equal 4.
Because it's not in the mathematics itself. It's in the way we value things. So, for example, does a mathematics paper stand on its own, or are we seeking to advance the careers specifically of female mathematicians because we feel bad that a mathematics department is 95% male? Well, now, there are good reasons to want to diversify mathematics departments, and I'm not a conservative. I don't have a strong viewpoint on what are the right answers here, but I do believe that there are legitimate viewpoints on both sides of these debates, and increasingly, there is no legitimate space to object at universities. And not just my university is pretty good about this, but in the whole university system in general.